Gods of War 2. The War Never Dies Young. Chapter 1. Stuart was sitting in a room at Holy Island Castle thinking about the war and what they have been through and how he's lost so many close friends and how come the White Knights won so easily but so hard at the same time, all the pain of loss. And then Ye walked into the room and said, "We must go around the world to find out whether all the demons have been destroyed and Earth is able to be restored." Stuart agreed, but he wished to sleep first, and Ye sat by the fire looking into it. And Stuart woke up and ran into the room with great fear. He then said, "Lee, we must leave this castle because all the humans who have the brand of 666 on their arms still fight for Satan because they have been brainwashed, which means he must still live on in hell, which means death still exists." Lee and Stuart then ran to the cities all around looking for people who we could give a sword to fight with, and then people who weren't captured by the demon army gathered around, and Stuart began to make a speech saying, "Everyone, an army of humans who will spare no one, heads in the direction of here, so you may as well pick up a sword and try to defeat it because otherwise you will have no mercy and you will be killed." So everyone began to walk towards Lee because he had piled up all the swords, and Ye noticed that Nathan's sword was picked up by a young man and he was doing some moves with it which Ye was quite impressed about, and he said, "My uncle taught me how to fight with a sword." He then looked at Lee and smirked and held out his hand as in to shake Lee's hand and said, "My name is Andrew. I am from near London. I managed to get here. We were heading for Holy Island because we heard that the White Knights were there, but I guess we missed the battle." Ye then nodded his head and said, "I lost many close friends to me. I had to kill the one I love to bring short peace to Earth." Andrew then said, "Well, I hope you will see her again." Ye then nodded and looked at Stuart while he trained people how to use a sword, and later in the day Stuart come to Lee and said, "Will you look around and see if there is any armies heading this way, because we will have to prepare, and if the people aren't ready they must be told what they should do in case they are afraid." Ye then nodded and took Andrew with him and began to walk 10 miles south. He noticed buildings were destroyed and Andrew said here would be a good place to make a lookout point. Ye agreed and they began to make a lookout point, and then they climbed into it, and Andrew told Lee how he lost his wife because she was stabbed by a demon whose leg and one hand were cut off. She was bitten and it got infected and she died because of it. Ye then knew it was his fault. Ye knew he should have killed that demon. Lee and Andrew fell asleep, but Ye woke up because he found it hard to sleep, and Ye saw lights that looked like talk coming closer and closer in the distance. Ye woke up Andrew and said, "Look, it's the army of humans who fight for evil." Andrew said, "We must destroy this lookout point and head back to Stuart and the people in the small campsite." They destroyed the lookout point and ran to the campsite and told Stuart the army was coming. Stuart then screamed, "Everyone get up, the army is coming, draw swords and fight to the last man, survive and defeat this army." Chapter 2, The Battle That Could Not Be Won in 100 Years. It was dark, very dark, and smog choked the blackness as if it was the very breath of the extinguished sun. The hills echoed the rumbles of Mother Earth and a terror skulked the camps. Each man shivered in his own personal fear. The sword close to his chest and those eyes that teach us of passion and of love fall in bleak black hatred. The hills could not be seen and the camp was washed with sewage and the stench of rain that had poured earlier that day. Feet passed through the slop, each man in makeshift armor. The women fought too and children wailed for their mothers, deserted in the camps, comforted only by broken toys that echoed lost dreams. These are the children who would see the barbarism in man and would live for a lifetime to forget it. The nightmare was real. There was a boy who was only 12, his father had gone. Sleep could not reach him and he walked through the shadows and the valleys which would become death. He saw the army of the new White Knights, and in a flash of thunder, the Evil's men, blazed in amorous glory. All armor coated their shins and arms like a second skin, breastplates cut the marks of the beast, and the number shared by all was 666. Traitors and murderers, but they all lived in luxury, while the White Knights had nothing. Zordad was a king and Satan was his god. He had a thick beard and a prominent nose. This new world was to be divided among him. The beasts have subsided and Zordad's men rule all. Lee stood in the ranks of the army. Their leader, Stu, knew his time was over, but his final plans were set. A parade was on his lips, but a final plan was set. Zordad marched. His people marched. The whole world marched. The soldiers stood, and now they would fall like the wheat in the harvest. Hundreds of people killed each other in the crash and the first lines fell. Lee swung but was overwhelmed and he fled. The swords of the White Knights were beaten and broken. Cunningly pikemen charged from behind the lines and pushed Zordad's men back, forcing a distance. Then the White Knights threw rocks and spears. Archers on the hill hissed and shot and the Devil's men panicked. Zordad led his horsemen across the field and overt the White Knights' lines, hacking and slashing. Skulls were smashed and the blood ran across all faces. Lee had returned with more men but they were killed in the onslaught. Lee was trampled and cut but scrambled out of danger. Knives were flung around and blades sliced through the air. Zordad lost his steed but found Stu. His spear battered Stuart's shield but the White Knight both swords crashed and swung. They darted and lunged fighting like gods, yet Stu was struck in the arm. Zordad punched and followed with his elbow. Stu was belted in his bell and the wind rushed from him like the gasp of a dead man. Zordad came down with his scimitar. Stu could only block with his arms and the blood spilled from his bone. Stu crouched and cradling his wounds wished to see once more the radiant sun. He stabbed at the circling king. 666 was in his crown. Zordad blacked and kicked the sword from his hand. He grabbed Stu by his hair and lifted him so he could watch the massacre of the White Knights. The carnage of the Blackfields. They were running to the burning camps to save the children in their skins. Stu watched as people were impaled on spikes or butchered to feed the dogs. They would wait for him in heaven, though not for long, after Stu was strung up to a tree. As he choked, Zordad hacked his body from his head. And that was the end. However, somewhere, the wounded Lee with an arrow in his hip hid inside a cave. With him were the few people he could save, mostly women and children. Andrew was with him and the spirits of the dead. Chapter 3, A White Knight alone can never overcome this evil. This isn't a war, it's a clean-up by that Zordad. He wants rid of all good so that his master can re-rise from hell. I don't understand, Lee. I thought you said that you destroyed the evil Death and Satan because they were torn between realms. Ye just sat there tending to his wounds while Andrew waited for him to answer, and Ye said we White Knights did what we thought would bring an end to the war, but it hasn't. Whatever happens here will happen for a reason, and I'm going to wait till that king finds me, and when he does I will draw my sword and fight him and his whole army alone if I have to. Andrew stood with disbelief. He knew he was not going to survive. He knew he was going to die and there was nothing he could do about it. And night had fallen, and as Ye lay there in pain because of his wound, he heard Andrew saying a prayer to God, and Ye got up and walked outside of the dark gloomy cave and sat outside looking at the stars, wondering if Nathan, Stuart and Stephen were all happy in heaven. They had finished their journey on earth, and Ye began to wonder whether he would ever have the chance to somehow defeat this evil king. But all Ye will ever have now is hope, as he knows God will not send down all his friends who were once White Knights to help him, because he would have a long time ago. So Ye lay down and closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep. Ye felt thunder in his dream. It was as if it was all he could hear and feel, and he saw images of Nathan being killed by Death and Stuart being killed by the king, and then Stephen being thrown over Holy Island castle walls. There was nothing Ye could do to save them, and then he saw a vision of Lee fighting Death and Lee killing Death, and out of the darkness came the king, and Ye fought him, but he could not defeat him, nor could he defeat Lee. But he was encircled in an arena, and Ye knew he was never going to escape alive. Then a spear flew towards Lee, and it was making a terrible screaming sound, and as it hit him, Ye woke up, and there was a warrior of the king's Zordad. He had his spear pointing at Lee, and he said, "Are you alone, human? Why is your leg wounded? What have you been doing? Are you a White Knight?" And Ye lay there and never said a word. But Ye noticed Andrew behind him, and he jumped on his back and stuck his sword in the warrior's chest, and Ye got up and grabbed his red sword and said, "We must get the women and children out of here." And then Ye heard an evil voice saying, "You're too late, they are already dead and you will be following them, but not yet." It was Zordad. "So you told me all the White Knights were dead, you little rat." "But my lord, they were." "He can be a White Knight." Zordad turned around and said, "Well, he wears their colors, and that young boy, he moved like one. So you lied to me, Delychos. This will never happen again." Delychos was bowing at his feet and said, "It will never happen again." And as he said those words, Zordad pulled out his sword and sliced his head off, turned and looked at Lee and said, "Never rely on men, they always let you down. They can never count or pay attention to who's running away from battles. Coward, you a defender and you ran." Ye just smiled and said, "Only cowards use surprise attacks like you have just did, and if you paid attention to that battle, it wasn't a battle, it was an extermination, and I will have my vengeance for Stuart. I will give you 3 times the pain you gave to him, and I didn't run away, I crawled." Zordad smirked. and said, well, you will have to not be a white knight because I know every move they have ever made like a book. Death told me everything he knew. My young human friend, I tell you what, let's go back to my arena and I will fight you one-on-one, but first I fight your young friend. You can't say no to this one because you want vengeance, so please sleep on it. And then Ye felt something hit him from behind and he blacked out. Chapter 4: The Duels of Kings and Warriors. Lee woke up next to Andrew and he looked at Lee and said, Lee brother, you know that all I know is the White Knight's way of fighting and he has chosen me to fight him first, so he is going to win. So if you get beaten brother, I will await you in heaven alongside Stu and I will tell him you are trying everything you can to beat this evil. And before he could say anything he noticed his legs were chained and so were Andrew's, and a horse ran forward and he went with the horse. And there was a horse in front of Lee and he had no shirt on, just pants, and the doors closed and Ye heard the evil screams of Zordad and people cheering with evil taunts, and then there was clashing of swords, and then Lee fell into a small dream and Shua come to him and said, remember your training when you were a child, and I said to you, show that you are weak to your enemy and he will show you all his strength but also his weakness, and when he strikes you hide your strength and use it as a final blow, and that final blow will turn his strength into fear and his weakness weaker than weak. And then Ye heard the horse moving and he was dragged into the arena and his red dragon sword was lying on the floor near Zordad, and Ye was unchained and he threw Lee his sword and he charged at Lee and he fell to the ground and rolled along, but it really hurt because Lee's body was grazed, and Ye stood up and dodged his blows and fought like a knight, and Zordad just laughed at Lee because he thought that was all he knew, and he pushed Lee to the floor and said, you are worse than that young boy, so I'm going to kill you slower. Just then he charged with all his might, and then Ye jumped up and jumped to his side and slashed his arm, and the blood of the king was dark and rich like wild berries, and he charged again and Ye knocked his sword aside and sliced his leg and he fell to his feet, and then he rose again and said, you are having some luck today, but we will see if you have luck against my guards. He then sent 3 guards to fight Lee and then went back to the White Knight's way and he slowly killed them. One of them Ye sliced the other in the throat and the other he cut him in half with ease, and the other ran with fear, and Zordad killed him and he looked at Lee and said, if you want anything done you have to do it yourself. He then charged once more and then Ye leapt to his side, ducked through him over his shoulder and sliced his chest open. He let go of his sword to hold his large wound. Ye cut his wrists and kept giving him deep cuts, and then Ye stopped and said, I told you I would give you a worse fate than you gave to Stuart, so now I have kept my promise, so I will give you one more promise. If you tell the guards to let me go free I will quicken your death, if not I will continue slashing you up till there is nothing left. The king lay there knowing he was beaten and he screamed, let the White Knight go, he has proven himself to be set free. Ye then sliced his head off and he ran for the exit, but they wouldn't let him go, and Ye saw Andrew's dead body lying on the floor battered, and the guards ran towards him, and Ye knew he could not win, so he was cornered and Ye was outnumbered and they charged at him one by one, so Ye began to fight and he cut many down, but they just kept coming, and then Ye felt thud in my chest and it was an arrow, and Ye fell to his knees and Ye looked up and saw this evil man, and he stuck his sword into his chest, and as Ye lay there he felt as if he was floating out of earth and his journey on earth was finally over, and Ye was going to the kingdom of heaven to live free. Chapter 5: Tempted by Evil. After the pain of death Ye woke up in the arena, and as he stood up he felt stronger but lighter, and Ye looked behind him and saw himself laying on the floor, and then he looked ahead of him and saw Satan standing there with death, and he walked towards him and said, you're coming with us, Lee. He then grabbed Lee's arm. He tried to pull him off him but Ye couldn't. He then dragged Lee underground and they ended up in a place full of fire, and it would be so hot to a human but it was so cold. Ye was shivering. Satan put Lee in a dark room and said, you will wait there until called for. Don't worry, even souls can sleep, so please by all means sleep and we can talk business in the morning. He then slammed the door, so Ye sat in a corner. He felt so cold and alone. He was wondering why he never went to heaven and why he was here, and Ye began to fall asleep, and before he could fall into a sleep the door opened and it was Satan. He made Lee walk into a large room with a table, and Ye was forced to sit down, and he sat in front of Lee and he said, I'm a businessman, Lee. I can give you power, anything you want. I can even get you angel. All you have to do is join me. You might as well, because heaven will fall, saying there's nothing left to fight back. And as he said that, Stuart, Nathan and Stephen walked in the room, and Nathan said, that's right Lee, you're best off joining with Satan. Ye then looked down and looked back up and said, I will need to think about it. He quickly rose to his feet, ran and jumped over Stephen and ran freely into hell and looked for the way out. Lee then looked around and saw fire everywhere and people being tortured. He then looked up and saw earth and heaven. Lee then began to run for a stairway and he bumped into someone who looked just like him. It smiled and said the way out is that way. He pointed behind him, so Lee looked at him and beside him was his sword. He grabbed it off him and ran past him. And he saw a portal where demons and minions and some other creatures were running through, so he ran for it and jumped, but he was pulled back by Satan. If you go through there you will tear yourself in two. You are stuck here, face it. He then disappeared. Lee was now alone. He lay on the freezing floor. His teeth began to gnash. He looked at his hands. They were beginning to burn. He had given up hope when he felt warm hands run through his long hair and a soft female voice saying, "Don't give up now." It was Angel. He looked around him and he was begging to float up towards heaven. "Look at me," said Angel. He did so. She smiled and so did Lee. They kissed. Angel then pushed him from her and ended. He fell and he landed in heaven in the city, and it was being attacked and all the people were running away with terror. A few demons ran towards Lee, who drew his sword and cut one of them in half and beheaded the other, and he bumped into a man and he said, "You are the last of the White Knights who survived the Battle of Holy Island Castle. Come, I will take you to where they are, but please we must go with haste." The demons were capturing souls and taking them back to hell to turn into nothingness, and this city, which was so large and reminded Lee of London, was being overrun with demons. He came to a bridge and it was very long, and at the other side was a city which was so large and it had forests and then gardens all around it. We had ran across fields so long and they began to cross the bridge and it began to draw up, so they had to move with haste. They managed to get across and the forest was thick and they had to run through, but this man knew where he was going and he guided Lee through the forest with ease. And when they reached the entrance of the city he said, "So much for paradise, it's about to be taken from us." He didn't say anything. The doors opened and he walked through and they walked up 17 flights of stairs and then along a walkway until they came to this large crystal palace, and he told Lee to go in there and speak to the king of the kingdom of heaven, better known as God. So Lee ran through the palace and came to God, and he jumped to his feet and said, "Finally we have all of them. They have all came to heaven. Welcome my son, you fought for good as best as you could. All your friends are in the other room eating and talking of happy times. Please go to them. I'm sure you'd like to see them." The king then sat down and continued reading. Lee walked into the other room and saw Nathan, Stu, Stephen, Scott, Jonathan, Angel, Ste and John and Clavery came over and said, "Welcome my friend, you finally made it." Lee jumped back, drew his sword and said, "Traitors, what are you doing here?" And Stu looked at Lee with a confused face and said, "What are you talking about?" He then said, "I saw you all in hell. You joined Satan." And at that moment God walked in and said, "No, they are evil copies of your friends to get you to join them. I'm glad you said no. You will see them again, but only the person that has been copied can kill them, and they are generals of Satan." The king said, "We must prepare for the war that's coming upon us at last." Chapter 6 Battle for the Cities. The 11 cities of heaven were at war. Lucius was the first city of heaven that came under attack from the armies of hell and earth, and all the White Knights were still in Ferelion while this city was being overrun, and all the angels who were at Lucius had to fall back across the bridge to Valor and make a stand there. But the minions and the twisted men charged across the bridge, and the angels were almost defenseless as they were trying their best to beat the armies of hell and earth. But after many days of fighting, their numbers were too many and were eventually overrun once again. Meanwhile Nathan, Lee, Stephen, Stu and John were crossing the Elysian Bridge to make a stand at Stiliath, but when they were halfway across we could see that the attack on Stiliath had already begun. Stu shouted with haste. Men, the White Knights charged into the city and saw the evil armies making a line. Nathan shouted, stand fast, stand fast." The orders from the King of Heaven was to not lose Stiliath so lightly. He told Stu to get the angels to use the catapults to destroy some of the houses to block the paths of the minions and men, so it was harder for them to get to the White Knights and take over Stiliath. Stuart called for the catapults to fire at the houses that were empty and made Stiliath like a maze to the invaders of hell. Nathan then turned to Lee and Stuart and said, "The best way to beat these is to ambush them. Kill the ones at the back, assassinate the minions and men at the back of the army. Let them take this city, but we will hold Elysian." Stu then told Stephen and John to gather what men they could and make haste to Berefa, because they have been holding out for a long time now and they will soon be ready to fall. Give them more strength. Eventually the back end of the minion and man army were in Stiliath, but most of the army was in Bereffa. Lee and Nathan grabbed one man, dragged him down an alleyway and stabbed him to death and then hid his body. They then climbed onto the roofs of the houses that were still standing and threw a spear at two of the men and lay down once more, but one of the evil soldiers noticed the noise and came along. Lee drew his red sword, jumped behind him, sliced his arm off, twisted him round whilst Nathan stuck a sword into his body. He then fell to the ground and died. The army had now spotted Nathan and Lee. They were heading for the bridge which led to Bereffa. Lee and Nathan were halfway across the bridge when they noticed demons at the other side. Lee and Nathan were now surrounded at the center of the bridge and outnumbered. "Where is Stephen and Stuart? They should be at Bereffa, but yet Bereffa is overcrowded," said Nathan to Lee. Lee was also clueless to this terrible discovery and said, "We have no choice but to either wait here for them to come to us, or we can halve their numbers by charging into Bereffa, which I think is the best idea." Nathan nodded and Lee and Nathan charged across the bridge to Bereffa, and once they got close enough they discovered the demons were guarding the rear exit of Bereffa and they couldn't hear anything else, so Lee and Nathan snuck up behind two of the guards and they slain them. Then the other two were in shock. Lee and Nathan quickly jumped to this advantage and killed them both and snuck into the city of Bereffa. Nathan and Lee quickly came to the center of the city and found Stephen and Stuart with few men and angels standing still looking at the other side of the city. Lee and Nathan looked up and saw the whole army standing and awaiting orders to charge at the angels and white knights. "This is suicide, we should run." Then one of the angels said, "No, we must wait till they charge, because if we run they will charge. We need to buy time for the other cities." Chapter 7: The Return of Death. The army of the other side had now fully formatted and Lee had told the angels of the other army coming in through the south. Lee looked up to the other army and saw Death come through the crowd of demon soldiers. Death walked to the middle of the city alone and offered a one-on-one duel between him and another. Death noticed Lee in the crowd and pointed at him and said, You're the one I want a rematch right now." Death stepped forward. All the angels and white knights were looking at Lee. Stuart said, "Lee, don't go, he almost beat you last time, don't let him beat you this time. You saw what he done to Elise and Jonathan." Lee looked down at his feet, drew his red dragon sword and walked forward. He turned round to the white knights and said, "If I die, don't fight to the last man, do what you can and fall back to the next city." Death and Lee walked to the middle of the square, which all around had white buildings all around it and had a large fountain in the middle. Lee got into the fountain, so did Death with his black armor. They were standing toe to toe. The intensity was getting larger and larger. You could feel the nerves of both armies waiting to see who would draw first. Silence was all around. Lee pulled up his hood onto his head. Death drew his sword. Lee jumped back, opened his cloak and threw a dagger into Death's right shoulder. He then charged and continued working on his right shoulder. Death pushed Lee into the water and began to hold him, trying to suffocate him. Lee then pulled out a second dagger and put it in his right leg. Death fell back and out of the fountain and hit the ground. Lee jumped up full of anger. Lee jumped towards Death with his sword above his head, about to slice Death's head off. Death managed to put his sword up and clash swords with Lee. Now each other and Lee and Death were swinging and parrying each other's attacks. Death knocked Lee's sword out of his hand. Lee was cornered between two white buildings. "I have you now," laughed Death. Lee looked up, saw an axe on the wall as a decoration. As Death swung his sword, Lee rolled under, grabbed the axe and hit it off Death's spine. Then Death fell to his knees. Then Lee dug the axe into the left of his chest. Death's mouth opened with pain. He then fell to the floor, his nerves still twitching. Lee came out of the alleyway in Death's clothes to fool the demons. The demons cheers and Lee removed the armored mask and the demons fell quiet. Suddenly one of the demons screamed, "Charge!" The demons charged towards Lee and the white knights, who were now surrounded around the fountain in a circle. The white knights were encircled and one of the angels ran into the fountain and said, "Hold them off while I open the secret hatch." Demons were being slain, but so were the angels and white knights. The angel eventually got the hatch open and the angel said, "Hurry, it won't stay open for long. It closes after a while and it will never be opened again from the outside, so please with haste." The white knights and angels jumped into the hole where the hatch one was. As Nathan looked up, he saw it was now closed. Once Nathan reached the bottom, they were in a tunnel way. "Where does this lead?" asked Stuart. The leader of the angels turned and said, "Just under the bridge. We can climb and run across to Stiliath. It's a hopeless cause to stay in Valor and hold it. We have destroyed one of the bridges that lead to Helthon, but it won't take them long to turn their attention to Frillian." The tunnel was quite dark, and as you listened above you could hear the chants of the demons and General S speaking of victory. Look at them run, they know it's hopeless, we will destroy them soon, they will have nowhere to run, and where is their God? He is hiding in Helthon, he won't even get out of his throne and fight. Then the demons would laugh. They began to notice the tunnel was getting lighter. As they were reaching the end of the tunnel they reached the end, and Stuart climbed the ladder first to see if there was any demons around who needed to be slain before the rest came up. There was 3 guarding the entrance and looking out for possible attacks from Ferillion. Stuart sliced one of their throats, kicked the other off the bridge, and the other demon tried to run, so Stuart threw his sword and it stuck in the back of the demon. Stuart then called the 12 angels and 30 white knights up onto the bridge. Chapter 8 Sacrifices of the People in Elysian. The angels were trying to destroy the bridge connecting Elysian and Shieldrome, but they needed more time, so the people who were in the cities decided to sacrifice themselves, but they were easily slain. So some white knight and angels go to the front of the bridge and make a last stand to give the others a chance to destroy the bridge. The demons had taken almost all of Elysian, now there was only the bridge to take. The white knights, Joe, who was one of the leaders in the city of Elysian who fought for the white knights, had ordered the white knights and angels to draw swords and charge, so they did, but they were so outnumbered and overrun they being killed off easily. Joe saw all around him the knights were being cut down, so he ran to the middle of the bridge awaiting the advance of the demons. He then provoked them and they ran towards him and drew their swords. He ducked under one strike, sliced open his back, cut the other's arm off, kicked the other off the bridge, and a strong demon's cut his hand off, so Joe jumped on to him and took him off the bridge with him. The angels had just fixed the machinery to destroy the bridge. Some demons made it across, but the angels had managed just below the bridge in time to stop most. The angels then had slain the demons that had made it across. Meanwhile on the bridge connecting Stiliath and Ferillion, Nathan hear words of reinforcements and they must hold Ferillion, so they decide to make a stand on the bridge and form a line. The demons charge, the angels pull out their bows and fire upon the demons, then the white knights charge and slay a few more demons while the angels reload. The angels shouts, "Duck now, fire!" The white knights drop to the floor and the arrows hit the other demons. The remaining demons retreat back to Stiliath. All of a sudden the other demons from the other cities arrive and reform their lines, putting shield wall then and infantry behind. To the bows were now useless. The white knights and angels decide to defend, parry and fall back. While they did, the demons attacked in lines, so the white knights and angels would slay what they could then fall back. They did this all the way across the bridge to where Ferillion is, and the angels had to towers either side of the bridge with bowmen in. Once the white knights and angels reached Ferillion, the angels were now firing their bows over the shield wall and into the infantry. The white knights form a line behind the towers and look forward across the bridge and see the catapults being dragged over. The angel captain screamed, "Abandon tower!" The angels in the tower left the tower. Suddenly the catapults were fired onto the towers and the towers fell. The demons now charged into Ferillion. The defenders crossed the river onto the white fields. Chapter 9 The Arrival of the King of Heaven. In Helthon the gates of the Crystal Palace opened and a man with white armor, very muscular and twice as big as any man could, led an army quite large through Shieldrome. This man was on a white horse. His hair color changed from white to dark when his mood changed. All the people in Helthon were laying flowers at the feet of the army, and some were kneeling and crying, some were cheering them on. There were rows and rows of angels and men leaving the palace almost as far as the eye could see. The gates to the city opened and let the King of Heaven onto the bridge with his army. They then arrived at Wavendon and collected whatever men they could. The King of Heaven said, "We now go to end this war and bring peace once more to my people. Join me in the fight to victory. Pain is now, victory is forever." So people all around grabbed a weapon and began to follow the king. All around building were white and the ground was stone, and in the distance you could see Valor and Lucius. Burning smoke was traveling all around as they crossed the bridge towards Berefa. God then called forth Gabriel and said, "Ride ahead with 200 men and give the brave souls in Ferillion help while we arrive." Gabriel took his men and shouted with haste, and they rode ahead. God stopped at the bridge at Wavendon, turned round to his angels and said, "Some of you will stay here in case we have to pull back. We will need fresh troops to push them back while the ones who fall back recover." God jumped off his white horse and looked at Ferillion and saw it go up in flames. The smoke could be saw for miles. What was once a beautiful white city is now turning black. God then ordered his men to ride fast. Lee and the white knights were being pushed back. They came to a long street where the ground had 30 centimeters of water all the way down it. The tired feet of the White Knights were now being cooled as they were slowly falling back. The demons would charge, so would the White Knights. Nathan ordered hit and fall back, hit and fall back. The White Knights had a firm line of two. One of the lines were shield men and the others were armed with two swords. The demons strike D and were blocked by the shield wall. The shield wall would then duck and the White Knights would throw one sword into the demons and charge with their second sword to retrieve the sword they threw. Then they would pull back. At the end of every building there was an alleyway. The White Knights were now at the end of the alleyway. Once we fall back this time we will have to fall back to the bridge, Stuart shouted. All of a sudden horsemen came rushing from the bridge charging towards the demons. The White Knights followed as a support. The demons were startled and slain and the ones who remained retreated back to the bridge which connected Ferulian and Stiliath and stood firm at Stiliath. "We need to hold this city until our king arrives," said Gabriel. Just then a liquid flame appeared in the center of the bridge and began to take form of a person. This turned out to be the Lord of Darkness himself. Gabriel began to take a few steps back slowly, then stood firm and proud once he heard the drums and trumpets of the King of Heaven. "He's here," Gabriel cried. Lee turned his attention to the bridge where 3 horsemen had now arrived and 7 what looked like warriors stood in front of the horsemen and the Dark Prince. "It's our opposites," cried out Lee. The Dark Knights drew their swords. A few angels ran forward and fired their bows, but the Dark Knights kicked them to the ground and decimated them. Nathan, Scott, Jonathan, Lee, Stuart and John, also Stephen, stood firm in a line, began to walk forward towards these Dark Knights. As they were 8 meters away from each other, both sides stopped. Chapter 10: The Duels of Good and Evil and the Loss of Ferulian. One of the Dark Knights stepped forward and drew his sword and awaited one of the White Knights to do the same. Lee drew his sword and stepped forward. The 2 opponents circled each other looking for a weakness. The Dark Knight charged forward swinging his sword. Lee ducked, turned and swung his sword and clashed with the Dark Knights. The Dark Knight kicked and punched Lee to the floor and began to swing his sword. Lee dodged and put his sword in the way to block the strikes, then eventually rose back to his feet and kicked the Dark Knight in the back of the legs to strike him to the floor, and his helmet fell off and rolled over the edge of the bridge. It turned out to be Scott. His eyes were black and his face had burn marks and cuts and he looked in pain and torment. Scott jumped to his feet and charged once again. Lee threw him over his shoulder, and while Scott was in midair Lee turned and sliced his hand off. Scott dropped his sword and rose to his feet. Lee pushed him, then jumped back, picked up Scott's sword, threw it at him. It went into his chest and he then kicked him off the edge of the bridge. Lee fell to the floor with exhaustion. 2 angels came and collected him and took him to the other end of Ferulian. Nathan drew his sword and threw it at John. The echo of the sword moving in the air got louder and louder as it came towards John and sliced his head off. Stuart looked at one of the Dark Knights while he drew his sword. He had a sword which had a black dragon head on the holder. Stuart then knew it was Lee. He then heard a thud to his side and saw a sword inside of Scott as he fell to the floor and he disappeared. Stuart, Jonathan and Stephen charged at Lee, and Dark Jonathan was quick to be slain, but the Dark Stephen was quick to kill the good Jonathan. Stephen and Stuart both stuck the sword into Dark Stephen. "Stephen, get out of here, I'll take Lee." Stephen nodded and ran. Lee then looked at Lee, who was standing looking at Stuart, who had his sword drawn. Also they charged. Everything Stuart threw at Lee was being blocked and Lee kept kicking him to the ground. Lee then kicked his sword out of Stuart's hand, so Stuart now had no weapon. Then Lee kicked him to the ground. Stuart looked to his right and saw the head of an arrow. Lee took off his helmet and picked up Stuart with one arm. "You are not that good," said Dark Lee. Stuart then stuck the head of the arrow in Lee's neck. Lee dropped Stuart, who then picked up Lee's black dragon sword and stuck it in his chest. He then picked Lee up and threw him off the bridge. "Go back to the hell hole that you came from." Stuart then was knocked down by one of the 3 horsemen, and as he looked up he saw a horseman galloping towards him about to run him over. Before the horse got near him a bright light almost blinded him and a white horse collided with the dark horse. "Get him out of here," cried a voice. Stuart felt himself being picked up and carried away from the battle, and as he looked back he saw the white warrior fight the 3 horsemen. The King of Heaven was now fighting 3 horsemen. He charged at them while another charged at him. He jumped off his horse, sliced the head off one, pulled the other off his horse and threw him off the bridge, and looked up at the last of the 3 horsemen, who then retreated with the fear of the strength of the king. He ran back to the Dark Lord. The King of Heaven stood alone on the bridge when he saw the Dark Lord wave commandments to his dark army, which now was even more overwhelming. Now his whole army had now arrived. God called his horse and then jumped onto his horse and ran back into the city. "I want all my men to have their bow standing by, ready to fire upon the demons advancing over this bridge into positions," cried out the king. angles were now on top of building which were on fire, standing by to fire upon the demons. The advance began fire. The angles fired their bows and the first row of demons fell. The demons then charged at full pace into Ferillion. Their numbers managed to smash the line of defences. Some of the archers were slain because they could not retreat. The king knew then it was hopeless to try and hold them. Fall back, Lee, tell your white knights to fall back. Lee nodded and they all fell back to Wavendon, where the main army of the white knights and angels were gathering for the biggest battle of all time, for the biggest outcomes of all time. Chapter 11 Battle of the White Fields. The white knights and angels that were retreating from Ferillion came to Wavendon in the white fields, and there was a stream with a strong current below, and it had 3 bridges crossing over it. They crossed the 3 bridges. Lee, Nathan and Stuart remained with 6 angels. When the demons come close enough in range and you know for certain you won't miss fire, we have to take as many down as possible, ordered Lee. The demons had arrived and were forming a single file line in 3 rows to cross each bridge, and they began to advance. Fire! Cried Stuart. The arrows began clashing with the demons and they began to fall to the floor. We are out of arrows, shouted the angels. Nathan told the angels to fall back to the gathering at the other end of the white fields. The demons began to advance across the bridge. Then Lee turned to Stuart and Nathan and said, we need to cut down one of the bridges to slow their advance across. Stuart then nodded and waited until the demons were halfway across, and he then cut the ropes and the bridge fell into the river and the demons were carried away with the current. Nathan then cut his bridge and the demons fell as Stuart and Nathan ran to the other side of the fields. Lee remained waiting to cut down the bridge. We meet again, Lee, come draw your sword, meet me in the middle of the bridge, I will fight you one-on-one. It was Zordad. His soul was spared and he came to heaven to fight alongside Satan. He then walked onto the bridge and awaited Lee. Lee then drew his dragon swords. He then ran at Zordad, kicked him full force to the other side of the bridge. He ran to the side where the demons stood and cut the ropes. The bridge then fell to the other side and hung like a ladder, and Lee climbed up, and Zordad was at the bottom of the bridge swinging his sword at Lee whilst Lee blocked. Lee eventually climbed to the top and ran. Zordad climbed up, and as he reached the top and his hands were on the cliff edge, Lee swung down his sword and cut his hands off, and Zordad fell into the stream and was carried away with the current. Lee then ran to the other side of the white fields. There was a small beach near the white fields and some of the white knights were washing their wounds and cleaning themselves up ready for a battle. All of a sudden Stuart looked and saw King Zordad washed up on the shore. He drew his sword quickly. Get some rope, Nathan asked Stuart. Nathan gave the rope to Stuart and Stuart walked over to Zordad, then put the rope around his neck and dragged him over to a tree on the white fields. He then strung him up hanging by his neck. Stuart cut off his arms, legs and finally his head as his body lay there in pieces. Stuart said, I told you I would have my revenge. The horns of the angels were echoing all around. Quickly, white knights, to the field where our army harbors. The white knights now were in formations. What is our status, asked the King of Heaven. We are outnumbered 3-1, my lord, answered Gabriel. The demon army were now in sight of the white knights. The fear could be felt from most of the army. I can taste the fear from those who I have created. Please stand your ground. They will have to come to us. They will lose many numbers before they get near us. We have the best archers and we are not alone because we are all together fighting for each other to survive. A cornered beast is more deadly than a one who is not. The demons began to advance. Their speed gradually got quicker. The archers of the angels went 100 meters forward, then readied their bows, and the white knights also had bows to rally them. The first wave of arrows were fired and went through the flesh of the demons, and the angels fell back a few meters whilst reloading, then fired once more and continued this stance until the demons were in range of the white knights' bow range and made a stance. Draw fire! Cried out Nathan. Then arrows whistled through the air and hit the demons as they hit the ground. The angels then fired a wave to hit the demons on the wave behind and fell back a few more meters. The angels hit 1 arrow left each, and so did the white knights. Draw fire was once more they cry off Nathan. The arrows whistled through the air and cut through the flesh of the demons. Draw your swords, draw your swords. The sound of the swords being drawn was heard all around. Now my brothers, charge! The white knights charged forward as the angels fired their last arrows, and then they drew their sword. Once the white knights were in line with the angels, they all charged at once. With a roar of thunderous anger they collided with the startled demons and began slicing away. Lee and Stuart were at opposite ends of the battlefield, acting as a flank, waiting for the flag to be raised by Nathan to move. The demons did a full advance towards the battle, so the King of Heaven also advanced to meet them. Stay here and await the flag, commanded the King of Heaven. Lee and Stuart nodded. All but Stuart, Lee and a few men and the King of Heaven remained outside of the battle. Meanwhile Nathan was swinging his sword and cutting down demons with ease, and he saw that more demons were approaching his way. He grabbed the flag and raised it. Ready your weapons, charge, Stuart cried out, and the flank began to advance on horses. But as they came into the battle they saw the demons were starting to be pushed back and were whining the battle. How is this possible, said one of the generals of Satan. Never underestimate the power of the human spirit. You have failed me once again. Satan then drew his sword and stuck it in his general's chest and advanced forward alone. He jumped off his horse and collided with a few white knights. He killed them all brutally. He began slicing his sword. No one would challenge the Prince of Darkness until Stuart, Nathan and Lee set onto him. The Dark Prince smiled and charged at Nathan, pushed him to the floor. Stuart jumped onto him. As Lee went to stick his sword into the Dark Prince, he threw Stuart over his shoulder, kicked Lee in the chest, so he fell back, and as Nathan looked up he saw a white horse fly over him and he felt the weight of the Dark Prince be take off him. It all happened in slow motion. The King of Heaven and the Prince of Darkness met in battle. You are still a jealous fool, said the king. Well, as you can see, we have almost taken your paradise. Soon you will all be gone. Their swords clashed once more. Satan then grabbed Gabriel and kicked him onto the king, jumped on his dark horse and fled the battle. Look, you evil scum, your leader is fleeing. The demons looked up and saw their Dark Prince running away and they followed. The battle was now overcome. Let us go to the main city, said the king. Chapter 12. The Devil's Trick. The angels chased the armies of darkness as they fled from the white fields and through each city. All of a sudden the army of darkness stood at a halt and turned and faced the pursuing angels, and the angels had never seemed so startled. And Gabriel noticed this. Don't worry, men, for our brave king and his brave multi-race army. I will go and talk negotiations with the Prince of Darkness. Gabriel then left the few hundred angels and rode towards the dark armies. Stuart and Lee arrived. Why didn't you wait for us? The angels were quiet. Stuart then looked towards the center of the bridge and saw that Gabriel was talking with the Dark Prince. Stuart then nudged Lee. I thought the angels had no choice but to fight against evil and not reason with the ones who defy the King of Heaven, and if that is the case, why does Gabriel have words with the Darkon? Before Lee was able to speak, Gabriel was knocked off his feet and an angel screamed, charge! All the angels began to charge forward to save their beloved angel. Lee and Stuart also drew their swords, but the army of darkness retreated to Valor and then across the bridge into Elysian. The Dark Prince then ordered, bring the bridges, bring the bridges. The Dark Army lifted the bridges and carried it to where the bridge that connected Elysian and Shieldrome was. Stand them up, said Satan. The demons then stood up the bridges, let them fall. The bridges fell and connected Shieldrome and Elysian. The army of began to cross. Some stayed behind to fight the pursuing angels. As the angels arrived at the city of Elysian, the Dark Army had crossed. Kill these remaining demons, ordered Stuart, and the demons were slain. Few angels began to run across the pontoon bridges. So close, pull the bridges, said the devil with a smile on his face. The bridges were pulled and they fell into the unknown, and the angels fell too. And now time for the surprise. Move the armies into and then into Helthon, then destroy the bridge. The general nodded. The armies stood to attention and began to march into Shieldrome. The civilians began to look up and saw to their terror the Dark Army, and they began to run for Helthon. Where could he have gone if he isn't at Elysian, said the king as the army was in Lucius. As the army fiested to their victory over the Dark Armies, Nathan stood up and said, when do we march back to the mainland of heaven? God ate the last pay of his food and took a drink, and before he was able to say anything a villager from Shieldrome ran and fell to the king's feet. Please my lord, spare me some of your wine, for I have ran all day to tell you some important news. Lee arose and took a look at the villager and said, before you speak another word to you, king, tell us all your name. His name is Mark. I do know I created him. And then the king laughed and poured a drink for Mark. Please take a drink, Mark, and tell me why you have rode to war when I instructed you not to. Mark bowed and took a drink and fell to his knees and said, my lord, I hope you know I would not disobey your orders, but this was an emergency. The Prince of Darkness has sacked Shieldrome and has moved into Helthon. Please my lord, I have 5 good men with me. They wish to fight for our king and our homes. Please allow us to fight this time, my lord. The king jumped to his feet. Gather our forces for the sneaky attack. I will crush his skull. We move as soon as we are ready. The king's hair turned from blonde to red flames. He then looked at Mark and smiled. Here he threw Mark 6 swords. You may fight. Mark nodded and began to find his place in the army. Chapter 13. The takeover of Helthon. The army of darkness stood on the bridge outside of Helthon, and all that could be heard inside of Helthon was the wind, and the Dark Prince began to laugh. For a place of parades it sure is quiet and boring. He then laughed out loud. He then stopped laughing and knocked on the gates. Open this gate and all your lives shall be spared. May the royal family leave this city and feel the pain me and my army felt for over 1,000 years. Justice has been done. Allow me to come home, or none of us will have a home tonight. As he turned his back on the gates, they opened the door, and a man with white robes, long hair and a beard stepped outside. The Dark Prince grew a large smirk. Whichch slowly turned into a smile. The Son of God. He then struck him with his fist, and then he laughed. I guess you couldn't stand being bored anymore either. He then laughed once more. He then stopped and looked at the Son of God with an evil stare. What do you want? The Son of God shook his head and smiled and said, you may have suffered a lot for your last deed, but now you have done the same deed once again. You are banished from heaven, so leave at once. My Father is merciful, but even his mercifulness has its limits. The devil took off his helmet and looked at the Son of God. His black hair was tied back, his face was blue but also burned, and his eyes were bloodshot and red. Look at my face. I was once beautiful, now I look like a bottom of a human's shoe. I did what I did because I was created to be that way. The Dark Prince ordered his men to capture the Son of God, so they did so. The gates were then burst open and the army of darkness marched into the city, and when they reached the Crystal Palace he looked behind him and looked at the Son of God. You will never get away with this, said Jesus. The devil smiles at Jesus, the Son of God. He then punched Jesus. Jesus then fell to the floor, and the Dark Prince sat on the throne and his wounds began to heal. He became beautiful once more. His burns were gone and his hair was long and healthy, and he then arose to his feet and looked at the people all around. Everyone of Helthon of heaven, even now do you not recognize your great war general? Now maybe not, but you will recognize me soon. I know of the white army marching through the white fields towards here. My army will meet him halfway, including my army from the soul chambers. The dead soldiers were released from the soul chambers and the Dark Lord had his full strength. He then looked at Jesus. Release him and release whoever wants to go and stand by the King of old and try and defeat me. You are free to go if you wish, if not you may remain home. The dark armies began to assemble and march for Shield. Rome. Jesus, David, Ste and Andrew left the city to find God to warn him of the new terrible news. God had just arrived at Berepha when he saw 4 horsemen halt the army. The 4 horsemen arrived. It was Jesus, David, Ste and Andrew. Father, he has taken Helthon. He has opened the soul chambers and gathered his full strength. Chapter 14. A Lost Battle. How many men? Gabriel, Stuart. 6,000 angels, my lord. 8,000 men, my lord. 14,000 versus 24,000. It's going to be a hard battle, but it doesn't mean that they will win, said God. We need to think of a strategy. Get the main generals here now. The main generals of God now stood in a circle looking at the map. We are here, the white fields. Satan's army moves, but they will be tired. We should use the bridges to force them into a bottleneck. Once they overrun us, we fall back to the next city and force them into a bottleneck once more. They will lose a lot more men that way and we will save more of our own. Stuart then sat in silence after he had spoken while all the other generals spoke. Told Jeter of his plan. We should meet them head on right here, said Mark. Stuart arose. Are you insane? We would never win. My plan is our only option if we want to maintain the throne for our king. The rest of the generals agreed with Stuart. God then nodded at Gabriel. Gather the army, said Gabriel. All the men stood to attention in lines ready to hear their battle plan. Here is the plan. We build barricades at our end of the bridge. We then have the archers preparing to fire while the next line of men are ready to throw spears. Once they overrun that bridge, we fall back into the city and across the bridge back into Berepha, and we do exactly the same there, and we keep doing so until we end up at Elysian. Then we make our stand. Understood, men, shouted Gabriel. The men nodded and began to build the defenses for the attack of the dark army. The defenses were now ready all across the cities of heaven. There was Sil and Sama in the army of God who was awaiting the arrival of the Dark One in Shield. Rome, but all around you could hear the chanting of the dark armies, the clashing of their shields and chants from the dark army. Lee and Stuart were in Ferelion preparing the defenses there with Nathan and others. Stuart, will this plan work? Stuart stopped what he was doing and looked at Lee. Brother, as long as my soul is out here and not in the chamber, we can always win. Their numbers may be bigger, but remember what happened to the Zulus. Stuart then laughed, then began to build the defenses, and Lee stood deep in thought. Meanwhile the angels in Berepha were preparing to fire as the demon army began to walk slowly across the bridge. Gabriel shouted fire. The archers released their arrows and the arrows tore through the minions and demons and they were falling off the bridge. The demons began to quicken their pace and was getting closer to the other side of the bridge. Gabriel shouted fire at will archers. The angels began to release more arrows. More and more demons were falling. Gabriel then lifted his sword and looked up and to the left and right to the angels on the rooftops who were now preparing to fire. Then dropped his arm and the angels released their arrows and they tore through more demons while the others reloaded. Show them no mercy. Fire! The sky was covered with arrows. Demons were falling left, right and center but they eventually reached the barricade. The angels fell to the floor while white knights arose and threw their spears into the demons and drew their swords trying to push back the advancing demon army while the angels were falling back reloading their arrows. The angels were now ready. White knights fall. The white knights fell to the floor and the angels released their arrows that then went through the flesh of the demons. Nathan fell to the floor while demons were close to him ready to kill him. Gabriel drew his bow and released an arrow which went through the throat of a demon. They were now running through the city. The angels were in rows. Once they released arrows they ran past another row of angels who were readying to fire. They kept doing this till they got to the bridge which connected Berepha and Ferilion. Then they retreated back across the bridge into Ferilion. Mark walked over to Stuart holding a sword. Stuart, this sword is a katana sword. Use it wisely. Stuart nodded. The retreating angels and white knights ran through the barricade. Stuart then shouted, draw your bows. Shield walls ready to lift your shields. Prepare to parry men with the spear. Retreating angels also give us a volley. Prepare to fire you arrows. Lee stood at the back with Nathan getting ready to buy some time for the retreat to Stiliath. Here they come, shouted Stuart. The dark army began hitting their shields and chanting towards the angels and the men. The dark army stopped and stood still at the center of the bridge. Hold your fire, cried Stuart. Let them take their time. It buys our next level of defense more time to prepare. There was a great silence all around. There was smoke all around from the burning buildings. Minutes went by, not one word was spoken. Both sides just stood and looked at each other. It's a test of mind power, whispered Nathan to Lee. The one who fires first or charges first loses. Lee turned and looked at Nathan and said, I think the demons will lose because of their hatred towards us humans and angels. Just as Lee said that, a demon general walked to the front of his army, walked up to the barricade. He stood 10 feet away from the barricade. He had a smile on his face. He took all his armor off. Come, shoot your arrows at me, strike me down, said the demon general. No, do not fire, said Stuart. Stuart then jumped over the barricade, drew his katana, and the demon general drew his sword. He went so strike for Stuart's head, but Stuart rolled under his sword and stuck his sword into the back of the demon. Then he drew a small dagger and cut the throat. The demon twisted him round so he faced Stuart. The then kicked the demon general off the bridge. The demons charged. Stuart fell to the floor. Fire your arrows. The angels released their arrows. The arrows hit the demon. Stuart then arose and ran back to the barricade. Fire at will. The angels began firing continuous waves, but the demons managed to reach the line. Archers fall back. Shield wall forward, ordered Stuart. The shield wall went forward. The demons were now striking the shields, trying to break them, parry them now. The white knights grabbed their spears and then threw their spears at the demons. The archers then sent another wave to hit the demons. All back into the city, shouted Stuart. Stuart then stood by Nathan and Lee. Nathan shouted, draw your swords. The white knight drew their swords to give the angels time to get in position. Charge, shouted Nathan. The white knights charged into the demons. The demons were being cut down. Some white knights were also being cut down. The angels were now in position. Nathan turned and saw the angels were in position. He then raised his hand, fall back white knights. They then fell back. The angels then fired another 3 waves of arrows and then fell back to Stiliath. The army god continued doing HTIS same fashion over the next 3 cities and lost a lot of men, but the dark army lost a lot more. Chapter 15, a cornered last stand. God stood on the bridge which connected Valor and Elysian at the army which was gathering at Lucius. God turned to Gabriel. Gabriel, get the locusts. They do not have any horses. We will ride them down and sting them along the way. White knights, you must make a stand while we gather the remaining angels. Fight to the last man, my children. The white knights all fell to their knees praising God, and God bowed his head and turned away to his angels. Nathan led his white knights to the front of the bridge and saw that the demons began their hasted advance. Nathan walked a few feet forward, turned around to his remaining men, drew his sword, raised it in the air and shouted for the king. The white knights stood at a defensive stance. The demons were going as fast as they could. The shield wall was in position and it was slowly walking back whilst men were throwing spears and parrying with swords at the demons. They came to the center of the city and the white knights became surrounded. Nathan shouted, "Charge!" They all charged into the lines, swinging the sword at whoever they could, dodging strikes from the demons. Demons were falling to the floor. Stuart looked around and saw some of his white knights being cut down. He looked towards Lee and saw him killing a demon, and before he could turn around, a demon smashed him in the back and he fell to the floor. Stuart then blocked another demon strike and put his sword into the demon's stomach. Stuart managed to dodge an arrow, but it hit Nathan instead. Nathan fell to his knees. Then he felt a thud going into his stomach and he fell to his side and saw Stuart fighting three demons at once. He killed one of them, blocked another's strike while the other struck him in the side. He fell to the floor, rose once more to kill one of the demons and kill the other. He then fell to the floor, and as he did he saw what looked like horses ride over him into the demons. One of the demons looked up and saw the horses riding up to him. He screamed, "Locusts!" The demons retreated in fear as the locusts. They had what looked like armor and a crown of gold, but their faces were human. They had women's hair, they had lion's teeth, and on their chests they had an iron breastplate, and it sounded like many horses when their wings flapped, and they had a stinger like a scorpion's at their tip of their tail. They were charging towards the demons. As they fled with terror, they were knocking the demons off the bridges. Also the angels were firing their bows at the demons who the locusts missed. The locusts ran back through all the cities and the demons made a last stand on 2 white fields, but they were all slain. God charged with heavingly anger towards Helthan. His locusts burst through the strong gates. He saw Satan at the bottom of the stairway of his palace. He uimped of his horse, rolled strike down. The devil and God were fighting inside the palace. They got to the highest point of the palace, and if you look down you could see the earth. They were clashing swords. "You will not beat me this time." God the King of Heaven laughed. "You have already lost." Grabbed his arm. Satan dropped his sword. God then picked him up by the throat and kicked him off the palace, and Satan alone fell to earth, and as he was flying into the earth's atmosphere once again he burned and he landed in the North Sea. He rose with anger because he knew he did not have much time. Chapter 16. One more throne to reclaim. The King of Heaven sat on his throne. "Release the humans who died once more, form to reclaim my throne so we can celebrate this victory." Gabriel brought back Stuart, Lee and Nathan and the rest of the White Knights. The White Knights got on their knees. "Hail the King of Heaven." God stood up, walked towards Lee, Nathan and Stuart. "My friends, this was a great victory. The cities of heaven have been saved. I thank you for sacrificing yourselves for me, and this throne has been reclaimed. But there is one throne that has been wrongly claimed, and I did not choose him. His name is Natas. He the son of Zordad, but truthfully he is the son of the devil, and he was but a child when you were last alive. You have been in heaven 20 days, but on earth 20 years have gone by, and only a small force resists him. And if he destroys this small army, Satan will have a new army, and he will attack once more, and this time we may not be able to win. So White Knights, I must reincarnate you so you all may bring strength to the Highlanders. Nathan stood up, looked at his men. He then turned to God, drew his sword, got on one knee, offered his sword to God and said, "This sword will slay whoever you tell it to slay, my lord." Stuart drew his sword and said, "And this sword shall follow." All the White Knights drew their swords and they swore their oaths to fight alongside Nathan. God arose. "All men with 666 on their arms, foreheads, or wherever will all be slain. Go now to the lake at Lucius and walk into it, and walk to the other side of the lake. When you reach the other side you will be on earth. When your lungs feel the air you will be human once again." Chapter 17. Battle of Grimm's Monastery. "Further Grimm, they are coming from the east. The army of Natas is at our doorstep. They want us to fight for them. What shall we do?" Before Grimm could speak a voice echoed the hall, "Fight with the Highlanders." Grimm wasn't your best learner, a White Knight? Grimm nodded his head. "We shall help the Highlanders. Something tells me God has not left us to die here. Jason, let us prepare for battle." Jason smiled and began to move towards the large wall, readying to fire his bow at the men wanting to destroy the monastery. All the men were in position. Grimm stood in the middle and Natas approached Grimm and shouted, "We believe you are nursing traitors. Grimm, let us in and see if there is any traitors here, and if not we will leave your land in peace." Natas stood there with his arms held out awaiting Greem response. Greem then raised his hand and it began to glow into a fireball. He launched it towards Natas, who raised his ran and put water in the way of his fireball and said, "I see how disappointing." He then walked back to his large army and gave the order to advance. The Highlander readied their arrows and fired them as they went through the air. The men raised their shields and not one arrow harmed it. Twisted men. Greem laughed and said, "Fire again." The Highlanders fired again, and as they went through the Greem and his monks turned the shields into gunpowder and set fire to the arrows. As they hit the gunpowder they exploded and the Highlander began to laugh, but as Greem looked on towards Natas he could see he was not impressed. Greem began to laugh, but not for long. As Natas done a full charge he himself charged. They quickly climbed the walls and overwhelmed the monks and few Highlanders on the wall. It was a wipeout. Greem approached Jason and said, "Go to the river, get your men on the boats and cross it." Jason said, "It's useless, there is no wind." Greem put his hand on Jason's shoulder and said, "I shall pray for wind in the temple. Go now, my monks are almost all gone. Save your men, head north back to your homeland. You done enough." Jason shook Greem's hand and left him and orders his few hundred remaining men to fall back to the ships. As Greem walked in Toti temple to pray for wind, he approached the altar, fell to his knees and said, "David, if you're in the heavens, tell God, the King of earth, wind and fire, to give the Highlanders wind, and I will come to the heavens and join you." The men were all on the ships as the Twisted Men approached. "Where is this wind?" The Twisted Men got on the boat as the Highlanders fought them off as best they could, and all of a sudden the wind began to blow and the ships began to cross the river aloft. There was a few Twisraid men on the boat. They were quickly killed. As Natas stood on the ground at the edge of the river he then smirked and turned to the temple and ordered a few men to bring the monk out. The men dragged Greem into the gardens of the monastery. Natas saw Greem and said, "Very impressive tactic with the gunpowder and fire arrows, but as you can see I'm still here." He began to laugh. He orders his men to pick him up and place his back on the tree. He then requested his bow, which could fire 3 arrows to the same spot. Once he pulled back his 3 arrows and before he fired he said any last words. Greem then shouted, "God conquers all." As he stretched the all word out, Natas fired his arrows into the back of Greem's mouth, and they nailed him to the tree. He then said, "Men, we must pursue these Highlanders now. Advance." Chapter 17 The Battle of the Beaches. Natas' army were walking through woodland. It was coming close to sundown. Jason dropped out of the tree with Glenn. They drew their bows and fired 2 arrows, then dropped their bows all around. Arrows were coming out of the trees and ripping through the flesh of the twisted humans. Then Jason lifted his hand and commanded his men to fall back. His men jumped out of the trees and began to head for the cliffs. They could hear the advancing Twisted Men. Ambushed. "How dare those idiotic Scots! I was going to offer them a chance to live. Now spare none. Advance, push them into the ocean, let the fish feast on their flesh." Natas then jumped onto his horse and began to ride south back towards London with a couple hundred men with him. Jason and his Highlanders were now on the beach. They were cornered and there was no escape. Glenn looked up to the cliffs and he could see the army moving down to the beach. That they all began saying their goodbyes to each other, and eventually the twisted army of men had got into position. The remaining few hundred Highlanders had been arched. There was no escape. Twisted Men in front and either side of them, and behind them the sea. The moon was huge in the sky so that the reflection of the moon made the water look white. As the dark army began to slalom move forward, the Highlanders were in the water. They drew their swords and the Twisted Men lowered their spears. Jason looked behind him and saw tops of swords, and they were moving forward and coming out of the water. Then heads came out of the water. Then there was men wearing white armor. Glenn cried out with joy, "The White Knights!" The dark army was stunned and began to slowly walk backward. They ended up with their backs to the cliffs as rows and rows of men came out of the ocean. Then one of the dark generals shouted, "Charge!" The White Knights ran forward. Stuart commanded shield wall. The dark men collided with the shields. Nathan commanded spears. They threw their spears into the men. Jason looked Glenn and said, "Give them a volley. Fire the arrows." The Highlanders fired their arrows in the air. They ripped through the flesh of the dark armies. Some of the Twisted Men began to retreat. Lee and Stuart stood back to back killing men. Stephen was cornered by 4. One of them swung his swords. He ducked, sliced his leg off. The man fell to the floor screaming in pain. He put his blade through his stomach. He then picked his sword up so he now had 2. One Twisted Man was in front of him and one either side of him. The one in front put his sword above his head as if to strike. Stephen grabbed a spear, threw it in him, drew both his swords and charged at the remaining 2. He blocked one hit and killed with the other. The one remaining tried to run Stephen through the sword and it stuck into his back. Nathan was fighting a man. He swung his sword. The Twisted Man dodged. He picked up a spear and threw it at Nathan. Nathan rolled under it and stuck his sword into the gut of the twisted man and the spear went into Johnny's back. A man with very thick armor and two swords charged towards Lee and Stewart. He swung both his swords. They blocked and tried hitting this man but it couldn't park the armor. He then dropped both his swords, laughed, picked up Lee and Stewart by the throat, and Jason just killed one man. He looked up and saw what was happening to Stewart and Lee. He grabbed his bow and aimed for the throat of the man and he released it, went through the man's throat. He then dropped Stewart and Lee. Stewart and Lee then picked up their swords and beheaded him. As they looked up, all the men was lying apart from the few hundred who retreated. The battle was now over. Jason walked over to Nathan, put his arms around him and said, "We all owe you our life." Before he could finish, Nathan interrupted him by saying, "It is not me you owe your life to, it is the King of Heaven, and we are his warriors, and now you are too welcome." He then opened his arms and Nathan and Jason hugged. Chapter 18 The Meeting with Gabriel. The White Knights and Highlanders had now marched into England and were now at York. It was all rebuilt but the people had hidden themselves away. There was a sign on the top of every door, "Those who side with God shall receive no mercy." York Castle was empty when they arrived. They were standing in the courtyard. Silence was all around when all of a sudden they heard, "Finding it hard to get to London." With haste, Lee and Stewart drew their swords as they turned round to see Gabriel. They then breathed with relief. Gabriel smiled, "Just here to send a message outside York. We have gathered enough horses and food to get you strong enough to fight Natez's army, and we have gathered horses to get you to London with haste. Do not worry about Natez. Once you defeat his army we will come down and sort him out. He may only be human but he has power beyond any human. He is more powerful than angel or even you, David." David then nodded. Gabriel then looked at Nathan and said, "Natez does not know of his defeat yet. His retreating men are hiding here in York, but we found them and gave them a plague, but it won't start until you all leave York. They don't have the strength to get to London, but Natez is not stupid. He will suspect something if he doesn't hear anything within the next 2 days, so you must not take too much time to rest. I leave you now." Gabriel then disappeared and all that was left was feathers. Nathan had gathered all his men to Tojita and left York. He then saw a hill where angels were waving. Once he waved back, they also disappeared. Once they got to the top of the hill and looked over, there was a lot of horses and sacks full of food. Everyone cheered, and as they all got their food and horse and began to advance forward, they saw a dark cloud coming towards them. Once it was close, it was loads of flies and they were heading into York. "Must be the plague," said Jason to Lee. Lee nodded. Nathan turned to Stewart and said, "We must now go forward." Stewart raised his hand then dropped it and everyone began to move forward as they were heading towards London. They had just passed through Derby when Lee looked up and saw the moon going in front of the sun. The looked like it was on fire and it was dark all around. Nathan turned round and said, "We rest here." The White Knights set camp and began to cook food, and the camp was in good spirits, mostly watching the eclipse. It had not moved and many hours had passed. Lee walked into the woods and there was a lake. He looked up at the eclipse and he heard, "It's a sign that means the portals are locked and will not be opened until there's a balance or a one-sided race out of good or evil." Lee turned around. "Angel," he said. She approached him. He fell to his knees, took her hand, kissed it. She pulled him up and she put her arms around him. They kissed passionately. "Why are you here?" Lee whispered. She touched his face and smiled. "I came to see you and tell you once this war is over we can finally be Tojita and be rid of war and evil." She then put her arms around him and whispered, "Remember, follow Nathan." She kissed him gently once more. "Now I must go and so must you." She walked back as her hand was held out holding Lee's. She then let go and walked into the lake. Then strong winds began to blow as Lee heard Stewart and Nathan calling out to him. To Lee, he ran towards them. He found them. "Come, we must go." Brother David said he felt a presence. Lee laughed and said, "Don't worry about it, brother, it's gone now." He then smiled and walked past Stewart and Nathan. Chapter 19 The Battle of London. As Nathan got to the top of the hill he looked forward and saw the city of London. "London, the place where it ends. Get into position," said Nathan. The army began to assemble into formation and began to march towards London. A scout said, "Stewart, he will know we are here now. Be prepared," said Lee. The army began to walk into the city. The streets were dead. The White Knights came to Trafalgar Square and there stood lines and lines of twisted men fully armored. "Stop!" cried Nathan. The dark army began to fire their bows, shields up, shouted Stuart. The arrows whistled through the air and only hit the shields. Jason archers. Jason raised his hands. Fire. The Highlanders released their arrows. Charge, shouted Nathan, while the White Knights charged. The Highlanders followed, reloading their bows. When they came close to the lines, all the first line fell to the floor while the second line threw their spears into the flesh of the men. The twisted men were shocked as the spears cut through them. Then the rest of the line fell to the floor and Jason ordered his men to point his arrows straight and release. Arrows once again whistled through the air and hit the men. They were falling to the floor. Then all the White Knights arose. The first wave then threw their spears, then drew their swords and charged into the lines. The dark men were so surprised that their swords and even drawn the White Knights began to cut through the lines. They got to the center of the square and blood was all over. Lee stood on one of the lions and jumped into one of the crowds and knocked a lot of them over, and Stuart and Nathan charged and began slaying a lot more men. The twisted men retreated once more to the castle the Dark King Natas had built. The White Knights charged into the castle. Nathan stopped and said, "The tables have turned. We have the number now. We will see who will lose." Lee and Stuart followed Nathan as he began to climb the stairs. Few men challenged them along the way, but they collided swords and killed them. They caught one man and Stuart put his katana to his throat. "Where is your cowardly king? Tell us and you and your family shall be spared." The Dark man said, "Has in the main hallway, the top floor." They left the twisted man on the stairway and got to the top level, and Nathan kicked open the door. They walked into the hallways and saw a man with his back to them. He had a crown on his head. "You Dark One, turn around and meet your destiny." All around there was laughing. He turned around. His hair was dark, his eyes were dark, and his crown was gold. "Ha ha, you really think you three White Knights can destroy me?" He laughed out loud. "That all?" The mirrors around cracked. His hair turned grey, his eyes green, his crown black. He opened his arms and stood on his tiptoes and he began to float. "Come, give me your best shot." Lee, Nathan and Stuart charged. Before they could get near him, out of the shadows came out Satan. He speared Nathan to the floor, picked up Lee and threw him along the floor. He then kicked Stuart in the stomach, then uppercutted him so he done a flip as he went backwards in midair to the floor. The Dark One turned to his son. "Kill them, my son." He began to float towards Nathan when all of a sudden "Halt!" cried out Gabriel, and he had 15 angels with him. They all had their bows ready to fire. "Surrender and be judged, or die now and you shall receive no judgment. You shall never be allowed to leave hell." Then Natas shouted, "Nonsense." He charged towards Gabriel. Satan shouted, "No, son, you are mortal." Gabriel raised his hand. Fire. The angels fired their bows and 15 arrows went through Natas's flesh. He fell to the floor but rose once more, went to kill Gabriel, but Gabriel punched him and he flew on top his throne and he broke his chair and he lay there dead. Satan fell at his knees. "Knew all is lost, and you promised you wouldn't kill him." Gabriel smiled, drew his sword and stuck it into the devil's gut. The devil fell to the floor. Gabriel then turned to his angels. "We have control of earth now, hell, earth, and soon heaven will be ours. The White King shall rule no more after this night. The only army that could stop them fights for me, and the only army that could stop me is defeated, and the White Knights will follow me because they are human and easily lead. Kill these three now." Gabriel pointed at Lee, Nathan and Stuart, but they were all quick to jump to their feet and they charged into the angels and stuck their blades into them. They had slayed 9 before the angels began to fight back. By this time Stephen and David arrived with Jason and Glenn. They were fighting in the hallway. The last angel was cornered. Jason got his bow out and shot the angel in the forehead. Now Gabriel was all that was left. Chapter 20. The downfall of Gabriel. "Traitor Gabriel, how could you? The war was over and now you have made it last longer." Gabriel drew his sword. "Come, try and stop me." Nathan charged at Gabriel and Gabriel sliced his side and kicked him to the side. Nathan was presumed dead. Stuart and all the rest charged. Gabriel ran and jumped and kicked David in the head and he fell back. He then picked up Jason and threw him into the wall. He pushed Lee away but Lee got back up and charged back in. He grabbed Glenn by the throat and slammed him through the desk in front of the throne. He then drew his sword once more and began fighting with Lee and Stephen and Stuart. He was weaving and dodging the strikes of the 3 men, and as he jumped back to charge he jumped into a spear Nathan held up. He turned round in horror as Nathan fell to the floor, and Lee, Stephen and Stuart began cutting into Gabriel. They were slicing and dicing. He still had a lot of strength. No matter how many times they hit him, he kept getting back up. He then rose back to his feet and pushed Lee, Stephen and Stuart away. He then fell to his knees and Satan rose up. He was all burned. Smoke was coming off of him. He drew his sword. "This time I win. You are coming with me." He stuck his sword into Gabriel and they both went through the floor, and as Stuart arose to see where the hole in the floor went, it went straight into the earth. Chapter 21. The Wrath of God. The sun began to shine, the eclipse had ended, and out of the doorways people began to run, out of the houses on fire, and a loud voice in the wind, those with 666 shall burn in the lake. There was burning bodies all over the world now. Stuart, Lee, Nathan, David, Glenn, Jason and Stephen all arose. Where did they go? From the dark shadows of the hallways. They've gone to hell. Stuart, look behind you. Stuart turned around and there was his true love. Stuart couldn't believe it. He turned to Angel. How is this possible? The wrath of God. Stuart ran to her and put his arms around her. I missed you so much. I thought I'd never see you again, said Stuart. Then the two of them walked off away together. The King of Heaven appeared and Gabriel and Satan appeared in the room. Gabriel, why did you choose to betray me? Gabriel began to shake with anger. Because you made these pitiful humans, you gave them choice. They got to choose who they fought for, and the last was I had to fight for you. I had no choice, just as Satan had no choice but to be the bad guy. So when I came to Earth I saw the chance to have my choice, and my followers saw it too. As Gabriel opened his eyes, he was in Helthilion. And he saw he was floating, and he could see Earth, and he saw God throwing his followers down to Earth. He saw them igniting with fire as they entered the Earth's atmosphere, and they feel onto spikes. There they have their choice now. They can either stay still and feel no pain, or try and rise to cut off their wings to become mortal and die, and they will just come straight back to me, and I will do the same again, only it will be worse. He then turned to Satan. You cannot be allowed a third chance. You must be unmade. He put his hand over the devil, and he then began to melt into the floor and become nothing more than the floor. He then turned to Gabriel. Now you are the Dark One. He picked up Gabriel and he had threw him into the pits of hell. He became badly burned, and all around him he saw pain of the 666 army, the demons, Zordagnators, everyone who opposed God. He then went back to Earth to Nathan. Nathan, you shall be king. You are my eyes and ears and my voice. God then thanked the rest of the White Knights and went back to heaven to rebuild his kingdom. Chapter 22 Outcomes of the White Knights. Nathan became king and ruled till he was old, and he gave his kingdom to his son. Stuart married and was given land off Nathan, and he lived his days with his true love and his children. Lee took Angel and went to Japan to ask for the forgiveness of Shuai. He also married Angel and lived with the samurai. Scott went back to his parents' farm and he rebuilt it and lived there and married a woman known as Stephanie. David gave up his witchcraft and he decided to offer his services to Nathan, and he now designs the costumes for the king. Glenn and Jason both went back to the Highlands, their current way of life unknown. Stephen became Nathan's right-hand man.